I told myself I only went to the garage to grab a drink from the fridge, but when I found my stepbrother, shirtless and sweating, everything I thought I knew about us changed. When I opened the door to the garage, the sharp whir of the drill startled me, cutting through the quiet hum of the night. The air was thick with the scent of sawdust and motor oil, and the dim light from the overhead bulb cast shadows across the chaotic workbench. My stepbrother, Dylan, stood with his back to me, shirtless, the muscles in his arms flexing as he leaned into his task. I hadn't meant to find him like this. I'd only come to the garage to grab a soda from the mini fridge tucked in the corner, but now my footsteps faltered on the concrete floor. "Dylan," I called out, my voice louder than I intended. He froze. The drill stopped mid-spin, its motor whirring down into silence. Slowly, he turned to face me, his dark eyes narrowing. A sheen of sweat glistened on his chest, and a streak of grease ran across his forearm. "What are you doing in here?" His tone was clipped, defensive. I raised my hands as if to show I meant no harm. "Relax, I'm just here for a drink." His gaze flickered to the fridge, and he stepped aside slightly, though his posture remained guarded. I crossed the room, feeling his eyes on me the entire way. My skin prickled under his scrutiny, and I could feel the tension in the air, a mix of annoyance and something else I couldn't quite name. As I bent down to open the fridge, I caught a glimpse of what he'd been working on. A slab of wood rested on the workbench, its surface riddled with tiny, precise holes. Some kind of design, maybe? Or a project for his job? I didn't know much about Dylan's life beyond what little he shared during family dinners. "What are you making?" I asked, straightening up with a soda in hand. "Nothing." His response was curt, almost dismissive, but his tone carried an edge that made me hesitate. "Doesn't look like nothing." I took a step closer, my curiosity outweighing the warning in his voice. "Come on, Dylan. You can't spend hours in here and not expect anyone to wonder what you're up to." He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "It's just a hobby. Something to pass the time." I tilted my head, studying him. Dylan had always been hard to read, even back when our parents first got married and we were thrown into each other's lives. He was older, quieter, and had a brooding intensity that made him seem untouchable. Over the years, I'd learned to give him space. But now, standing in this garage, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than he let on. "Do you ever take a break?" I teased, leaning against the workbench. He smirked, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Why, you offering to help?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. There was something in his tone. A challenge, maybe, or a subtle shift in the way he looked at me. I felt a warmth creep up my neck, and I quickly broke eye contact, focusing instead on the soda can in my hands. "Not sure I'd be much help," I said lightly, trying to diffuse the moment. "But hey, if you ever need someone to hand you tools or hold a flashlight." He chuckled, a low sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "I'll keep that in mind." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The garage seemed to shrink around us, the silence filled with the faint hum of electricity and the steady rhythm of my heartbeat. "I should get back inside," I said finally, my voice quieter than before. "Yeah," he said, his gaze lingering on me as I moved toward the door. But as I reached for the handle, I glanced back over my shoulder. Dylan had already turned away, the drill back in his hand. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, something neither of us was ready to acknowledge. I didn't sleep much that night. The garage scene replayed in my mind like a loop I couldn't escape. The tension in Dylan's posture, the sharp glint of his eyes when he turned to me, and the way my chest tightened when our gazes locked. By morning, I convinced myself it was nothing. Just a moment born of curiosity and the oddity of catching him alone in the garage. But when I came downstairs to the smell of coffee and the sound of the news playing softly in the background, my resolve faltered. Dylan was leaning against the counter, his usual brooding demeanor in place, but something about him seemed different. He wasn't looking at me, not even a quick glance, as I poured myself a mug of coffee. "Morning," I said, trying to sound casual. "Morning," he replied without looking up. His voice was low, rough, as though he hadn't slept either. I leaned against the island watching him. He was dressed in a plain black t-shirt and jeans, but somehow he made even that look good. He always had a kind of effortless charm that annoyed me as much as it intrigued me. "Busy day ahead?" I asked, sipping my coffee. He shrugged. "Same as always." It was such a typical response, but the way he said it felt loaded. Like there was more to his day than he was willing to share. "Still working on that project in the garage?" His eyes snapped to mine then, sharp and assessing. For a moment, I thought he might snap back with a sarcastic comment or tell me to mind my own business. Instead, he surprised me. "Why do you care?" The question wasn't harsh, but it threw me off balance. I blinked, searching for an answer that didn't sound as curious or as intrusive as I felt. "I don't," I said quickly. "I was just making conversation." His lips curved into a smirk, the kind that always made me feel like he was 10 steps ahead of me. "Sure you were." I hated how easily he got under my skin. "You know what? Forget I asked." Before he could respond, I turned on my heel and walked out of the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. That evening, I found myself standing outside the garage door again. I told myself I was just out for some fresh air, but my feet had led me there like I was on autopilot. The faint hum of music drifted from inside, a low and gritty rock tune that made the walls vibrate ever so slightly. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the door handle. I didn't know what I was expecting. Another awkward encounter, maybe, or some kind of explanation for the tension that had been building between us. But as I pushed the door open, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. Dylan was sitting on a stool by the workbench, his head bent as he worked on the slab of wood from the night before. This time, I could see the design more clearly. Intricate patterns swirled across the surface, each hole placed with deliberate precision. It was beautiful in a rugged, almost haunting way. He looked up as the door creaked, his expression unreadable. "Didn't anyone ever teach you to knock?" he asked, but there was no real bite in his tone. "Didn't anyone ever teach you to lock the door?" I shot back, stepping inside. He shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "What do you want, Emily?" I hesitated, the question catching me off guard. What did I want? To understand him? To unravel the mystery of what made him tick? Or was it something else entirely? Something I wasn't ready to admit to myself? "I was curious," I said finally, nodding toward the workbench. "About that." He followed my gaze, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "It's nothing. Just a piece I'm working on." "It's more than nothing," I said, stepping closer. "It's incredible. What is it?" Dylan hesitated, as if weighing whether or not to let me in. Finally, he sighed. "It's for a client. Custom design." I nodded, trailing my fingers lightly over the smooth surface of the wood. "You're really talented, you know that?" For a moment, he didn't say anything. When I glanced up, I found him watching me, his eyes darker than usual. "Thanks," he said quietly. The air between us shifted again, the tension returning with a force that made my breath hitch. I should have stepped back, put some distance between us, but instead I stayed rooted to the spot, my heart pounding in my chest. "Emily," he said, his voice low. "Yeah?" He stood then, his movements slow and deliberate. The space between us disappeared in an instant, and I felt the warmth of his body before I even realized how close he'd gotten. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his tone carrying a warning that only made me want to stay more. "Maybe," I whispered, "but I am." Neither of us moved. The garage was silent except for the sound of our breathing, and I could feel the pull between us, magnetic and undeniable. And then, before I could stop myself, I reached out and touched his arm, my fingers brushing against his skin. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to break the last of the fragile boundaries between us. The moment my fingers touched his arm, Dylan's breath hitched. His eyes dropped to where my hand rested, then flicked back up to meet mine. There was a question in his gaze, but also something deeper, something unspoken and dangerous. I should have pulled away. I should have laughed it off, made a joke, anything to diffuse the moment. But instead, I stayed there, my hand lingering, my pulse hammering in my ears. "You're playing with fire, Emily," he said, his voice low and rough. "Maybe," I said softly, "but so are you." The space between us dissolved in an instant. 1 second, we were standing there, caught in a silent standoff. The next, Dylan's hand was on my waist, pulling me closer. His grip was firm, almost hesitant, as though he was giving me one last chance to back away. I didn't. Before I could think better of it, my hand slid up his chest, my fingers brushing against the smooth skin and the hard lines of muscle beneath. He was warm, his heart beating as fast as mine, and when he leaned down, his forehead resting lightly against mine, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his breath ghosting across my lips. I couldn't. The words wouldn't come, and instead, I tilted my head up, closing the final inch between us. The first touch of his lips was soft, tentative, but it set my entire body alight. He froze for a split second, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. But then he kissed me harder, his hands tightening on my waist. It was like everything we'd been holding back for years came rushing to the surface all at once. His hand slid up my back, pulling me flush against him, and I let out a soft gasp as his lips moved hungrily against mine. For a moment, the rest of the world disappeared. There was no garage, no family, no consequences. Just the two of us and the heat that had been simmering between us for far too long. But reality came crashing back far too soon. "Dylan," I whispered, pulling back just enough to look up at him. His face was a mix of emotions, desire, confusion, and something that looked a lot like regret. "This is," he started, but his voice broke off. He shook his head, stepping back as if putting physical distance between us could undo what had just happened. I crossed my arms, suddenly feeling exposed and unsure. "What are you thinking?" "That we shouldn't have done that," he said quietly. His words stung more than I expected. "Oh. It's not that I didn't want to," he added quickly, running a hand through his hair. "Trust me, Emily, I wanted to. But this..." He gestured between us. "This is complicated. Our parents don't define us," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. He looked at me then, his gaze softening. "Maybe not. But we can't just ignore the fact that we're under the same roof, that we're supposed to be family." The word hung in the air like a brick, and I flinched at the sound of it. Family. As if what had just happened between us was something forbidden, something dirty. "I didn't ask for this," I said, my voice trembling. "I didn't ask for any of it. For my mom to marry your dad, for us to be thrown together like this. And I definitely didn't ask to feel whatever it is I feel for you. Emily." "No," I cut him off, my chest tightening. "If you regret what just happened, fine, but don't act like it was wrong." He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I don't regret it," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But that doesn't mean it's not complicated." "Life is complicated," I said, stepping closer to him. "That doesn't mean we have to pretend this." I gestured between us. "Didn't happen." For a moment, I thought he might argue. But then his hand reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to tell me he wasn't ready to let go of this either. "We need to be careful," he said finally, his tone cautious. "I know," I said, squeezing his hand. "But Dylan, we can't just ignore this. Whatever this is, it's real." His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of hope in his expression. "We'll figure it out," he said. And for the first time, I believed him. The days that followed were a strange mix of tension and quiet understanding. Dylan and I didn't talk about what had happened in the garage, but it lingered between us like an unspoken secret, humming beneath the surface of every glance, every passing interaction. I caught myself looking for him more often, stealing glances when we passed each other in the hallway or during meals. Each time our eyes met, my heart skipped a beat, and I saw the same flicker of emotion in his gaze that mirrored my own. but it was also terrifying. Every time our parents were in the same room, laughing and chatting as though their marriage had created the perfect blended family, I felt a pang of guilt twist in my chest. What would they think if they knew? It was a Friday night when everything shifted again. My mom and Dylan's dad had gone out for dinner, leaving the house unusually quiet. I'd spent most of the evening curled up on the couch, flipping through Netflix, but not really watching anything. My thoughts kept drifting to Dylan, wondering if he was in the garage again, working on one of his mysterious projects. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I padded down the hallway, my socked feet silent against the hardwood floors. The garage door was slightly ajar, and the faint sound of music drifted out. I hesitated for a moment, my hand resting on the doorframe. What was I even doing? I told myself it was just to say hi, to check in. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside. Dylan was at his workbench again, his back to me as he sanded the edge of a wooden panel. He was wearing a gray t-shirt that clung to his shoulders, and his hair was tousled, as though he'd been running his hands through it. "Hey," I said softly. He turned, his eyes widening slightly before settling into a guarded expression. "Hey, mind if I join you?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Suit yourself." I walked over to the workbench, leaning against the edge as I watched him work. The rhythmic motion of his hands, the focus in his eyes, it was mesmerizing. "What are you making this time?" I asked, nodding toward the piece of wood in front of him. "Just a table," he said, his tone casual. "Nothing fancy." I raised an eyebrow. "Looks pretty fancy to me." He chuckled, the sound low and warm. "You say that about everything." "Maybe you're just good at what you do," I said, smiling. He glanced at me then, his eyes lingering on my face for a moment longer than necessary. "Maybe." The air between us grew heavy, the silence stretching out like a taut string. I could feel the pull again, the same magnetic force that had drawn us together in the garage days ago. "Dylan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He set down the sandpaper, his hands resting on the workbench as he turned to face me fully. "Yeah?" I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "Do you ever think about that night?" His jaw tightened and he looked away, his gaze falling to the floor. "Every damn day," he admitted. The honesty in his voice took my breath away. I stepped closer, reaching out to touch his arm. "Then why are we pretending it didn't happen?" "Because it's easier," he said, his voice strained. "It's easier to act like nothing's changed than to deal with what this could do to us. To them." "They don't have to know," I said quickly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "This is about us, Dylan, not them." He looked up at me then, his eyes searching mine. "You really think we can keep this a secret?" I nodded, my fingers tightening on his arm. "If it means we don't have to keep fighting this, whatever this is, then yes, I think we can." For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, with a sigh, he reached up to cup my face in his hands, his thumb brushing lightly against my cheek. "This is insane," he murmured, but his voice was soft, almost tender. "Maybe," I whispered, "but it feels right." And then he kissed me. It wasn't tentative this time, or hesitant. It was deep and desperate, as though he'd been holding himself back for far too long. His hand slid down to my waist, pulling me against him, and I let out a soft gasp as his lips moved against mine. The workbench pressed against my back, the rough wood digging into my skin, but I didn't care. All I could think about was the way Dylan's hands felt on me, the way his body fit against mine like we were two pieces of the same puzzle. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathless, our foreheads resting against each other. "This is going to change everything," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time for a change," I replied, my fingers trailing lightly down his chest. He let out a shaky laugh, his hands tightening on my waist. "You're gonna be the death of me, Emily." "Better me than someone else," I teased, a smile tugging at my lips. He smiled back, and for the first time in days, I felt like everything might actually be okay. The days following that second kiss were a blur of stolen moments and whispered conversations. Dylan and I were careful. Too careful. Always keeping our interactions in public perfectly normal, even mundane. But behind closed doors, or whenever we found ourselves alone, everything changed. There were glances that lingered too long, touches that carried more meaning than we dared admit, and the unspoken promise of something bigger brewing between us. We both knew what we were doing was dangerous, but that knowledge didn't stop us. If anything, it made each touch, each kiss feel even more exhilarating. But secrets have a way of surfacing, and it didn't take long for the cracks to start showing. It was a Saturday afternoon when the first real slip happened. Our parents were hosting a barbecue, the backyard buzzing with laughter and the smoky aroma of grilled burgers. I'd been helping my mom in the kitchen, chopping vegetables and setting out plates, when Dylan walked in. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice casual. My mom smiled. "Oh, that's sweet of you, Dylan. Emily could probably use a hand taking these out." "Sure," he said, picking up the tray of condiments and heading toward the door. I grabbed the bowl of salad and followed him outside. The backyard was crowded with family friends and neighbors, but somehow, Dylan managed to find a secluded corner near the side of the house. He set the tray down on a small table and turned to me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. "I'm fine," I said quickly, glancing around to make sure no one was watching us. "You're a terrible liar," he said with a smirk, stepping closer. My heart skipped a beat. "Dylan, not here." "No one's paying attention," he said, his tone soft but insistent. "Relax." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that someone could turn the corner any second and catch us. But before I could say anything, his hand brushed against mine, sending a shiver down my spine. It was such a small gesture, but it was enough to make me lose focus. And that's when it happened. "Emily?" My mom's voice cut through the moment like a knife. I jumped, snatching my hand away from Dylan's as she rounded the corner. "There you are," she said, smiling brightly. "Can you grab the cooler from the garage? We need more drinks out here." "Of course," I said, my voice trembling slightly. She didn't seem to notice, her attention already shifting back to the guests. Dylan gave me a look as I turned to leave, a silent reminder to stay calm. But as I walked back into the house, my mind was racing. That was too close. That night, the tension between Dylan and me reached its breaking point. We were alone again, the house quiet now that everyone had gone home. I found him in the garage, sitting on the workbench with a beer in hand. "You're gonna wear a groove into that bench if you keep sitting there," I joked, trying to lighten the mood. He didn't laugh. Instead, he looked up at me, his expression serious. "We need to talk," he said. My stomach dropped. That sounds ominous. "It's not," he said quickly, setting the beer down. I don't want you to think I'm ashamed of this." "Of us?" I blinked, caught off guard by his honesty. "You're not?" He shook his head. "No, but I am scared, Emily. Scared of what happens if this all falls apart." I stepped closer, my chest tightening. "Dylan, I don't want to lose you. Whatever this is, I don't want it to stop." He reached out, his hand brushing against my cheek. "I don't either," he said softly. "But we have to be smart about this." "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt electric, charged with all the things we weren't saying. And then, just like before, we gave in to the pull, our lips meeting in a kiss that was equal parts desperate and tender. The next morning, I woke with a pit in my stomach. Every stolen moment with Dylan felt like a thrill, but the risks were becoming impossible to ignore. What if someone had walked in last night? What if my mom's voice had come a second earlier at the barbecue? Dylan and I hadn't spoken since the garage. Not really. The intensity of that kiss still hung between us, but reality was seeping in, carving out the joy and leaving only doubt. It didn't help that our parents were glued to each other more than ever, basking in the honeymoon glow of their newly blended family. They wanted unity, harmony, and love, and here we were, threatening to shatter it all. That evening, we were thrown together again. My mom had planned a family movie night in the living room, complete with popcorn, blankets, and a lineup of rom-coms. I could barely look at Dylan without feeling the weight of everything we were risking. He seemed equally on edge, sitting stiffly in an armchair while the rest of us sprawled on the couch. At some point during the second movie, my mom dozed off against Dylan's dad's shoulder. I caught Dylan watching me, his expression unreadable. I quickly turned back to the screen, my pulse quickening. When the credits rolled and the room fell into sleepy silence, I slipped away to the kitchen, desperate for a moment alone. I didn't hear Dylan come in until he spoke. "You're avoiding me." I jumped, spinning around to see him leaning against the doorframe. His voice was low, careful. "Not here," I hissed, glancing toward the living room. "They're asleep," he said, stepping closer. "Emily, we can't keep pretending this isn't happening." I gripped the edge of the counter, my mind racing. "And what do you suggest we do? Tell them we've been sneaking around behind their backs? Blow up their marriage before it's even had a chance?" His jaw tightened. "I don't know, but I can't keep going like this. Watching you from across the room, pretending we're just..." He broke off, running a hand through his hair. "It's killing me." The vulnerability in his voice broke something inside me. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer, my voice soft. "You think this is easy for me? I feel like I'm drowning every time I see you and have to act like I don't care. But Dylan, we have to be careful. If we mess this up, we're not just hurting each other." He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine. Then he nodded, his shoulders sagging. "You're right," he said quietly. I don't know how to let this go." I swallowed hard. Maybe we don't have to, but we can't let it spiral out of control. No more risks. His lips twitched in a faint, humorless smile. Easier said than done. The door creaked suddenly and we both froze. My mom appeared, yawning as she stepped into the kitchen. "What are you two doing in here?" she asked sleepily. "Just grabbing some water," Dylan said smoothly, holding up a glass he'd snagged from the counter. "Yeah, me too," I added, forcing a smile. She blinked at us, her brow furrowing slightly. "Well, don't stay up too late. We've got brunch with the Millers tomorrow." "Of course," I said quickly. She wandered back to the living room and Dylan and I exchanged a look. That had been too close. Again. Over the next few days, Dylan and I kept our distance. It was excruciating, but it felt necessary. Every time we crossed paths, I forced myself to look away, to act normal. But normal was a lie, and the tension simmered just beneath the surface. Then everything came crashing down. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Dylan's dad had invited some friends over to watch a football game. The house was loud, filled with laughter and the sounds of cheering. I'd tried to stay out of the way, hiding in my room with a book, but my mom eventually dragged me downstairs to be social. I found myself in the kitchen, refilling the chip bowl while my mom chatted with one of the wives. Dylan was there too, leaning against the counter and looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in days. For a moment, it felt almost normal, until his dad walked in. "Hey, Dylan, could you grab the remote from the garage?" he asked. "I think I left it on the workbench." "Sure," Dylan said, shooting me a quick glance before heading out. I knew I should stay put. I knew it. But something pulled me toward the garage, my feet moving before I could think better of it. The door was slightly ajar when I got there, and I paused, hesitating. Dylan was rummaging through the cluttered workbench, muttering to himself. He looked up when he saw me, his eyes widening in surprise. "Emily." Before he could finish, a voice rang out behind me. What the hell is going on? I spun around to see his dad standing in the doorway, his face a mask of confusion and suspicion. My stomach dropped. "We were just..." I stammered, but Dylan's dad cut me off. "Just what? Sneaking off together like you've got something to hide?" Dylan stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Dad, it's not what it looks like." "Then what is it?" his dad demanded, his eyes narrowing. Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty damn suspicious. My mom appeared behind him, her expression confused. "What's going on?" Panic flared in my chest. This was it. The moment everything unraveled. "Nothing's going on," I said quickly, my voice shaking. "We were just talking." "Talking?" Dylan's dad repeated, his tone incredulous. "Yes," Dylan said firmly. "That's all." But the doubt in their eyes was clear, and no matter how much we tried to downplay it, the damage was done. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Dylan and I had managed to deflect their suspicions, but the cracks in our story were glaring. We couldn't keep this up. The next time we saw each other, it was like a silent agreement passed between us. We didn't speak, didn't touch, but the weight of everything we couldn't say hung heavy in the air. And for the first time, I wondered if this was a fight we could actually win, or if we were doomed to lose everything.